Hello and welcome to the webinar. My name is Josh McDaniel and I work with the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center. And in a few moments we'll start the webinar, but I wanted to first make a quick note and let you know that this is a regular webinar series. It's sponsored by the Joint Fire Science Program, International Association of Wildland Fire, and the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center. We have usually 1 or 2 webinars per month, and right now we're in the midst of scheduling them for the fall, and trying to nail down some dates and get some presenters lined up, but they're not quite there yet, so we don't have any to announce right now. If you're on the email list, you'll be getting the email announcements, so you'll know they're coming. If not, you can contact us and we'll get you on the email list, or you can keep checking the Advances in Fire Practice webpage, and I put a screenshot and a link there if you want to keep track of it that way. Okay, so first I'll introduce the speaker in a second for today, but first of all, I just want to let you know how a couple things work. The questions we handle in a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. So you can type your questions in and we will respond to them live in the webinar as we come to them. So the earlier you get the question in, the higher up the queue they are, the better chance that we have of getting to them. Also, the webinar is being recorded, and we post all of the recordings on the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center's YouTube channel. And the link to that will also be on Advances in Fire Practice, or you can just find your way to that YouTube channel through YouTube there. And you can get that and pass that on to anyone else you think might be interested in the webinar. And usually I get it up there about 30-45 minutes after the webinar is finished. Okay, so on to today. Bob Keane is going to be presenting today, and Bob is a research ecologist with the USDA Forest Service, the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and he's stationed at the Missoula Fire Sciences Lab. Bob's most recent research includes developing ecological computer simulation models for looking at landscape fire and climate dynamics, and also sampling, describing, modeling, and mapping of fuel characteristics. And he's also been working on investigating the ecology and restoration of whitebark pine. He's developed quite a few models for the Forest Service, and I'll list those. He's developed the CRB sum, land sum, fire BGC, and Fire BGC version 2, V2, landscape simulation models. He developed the first versions of the first order fire effects model and has written several fire hazard and analysis programs. He's also assisted in the development of FireMon, a fire monitoring sampling database management system, and EcoData, an ecological inventory system. And with that, I will hand it over to Bob.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Welcome everybody, and I want to thank Josh for giving me the chance to talk today. I'm going to talk about a really complex subject that is, you know, a lot of people think that predicting climate change in the future is relatively simple and that we should be able to do it really quickly, but it turns out that it's a lot more complex than our little minds can handle, and it turns out that all the changes are very difficult and to quantify and also to describe. So what I'd like to talk about today, before I even start, is I'd like to give my caveats for the talk beforehand. And these are 3 caveats that I've learned during the research that I've done with climate change and climate change simulation modeling. And the first thing is change is always constant. In other words, that you really can't say that a landscape is going to go to a particular species or a particular something, because that particular landscape may change by species over time, and even though you have a different climate, there's always going to be a disturbance regime or whatever that will influence the future composition. So change is always constant. So you have to always view climate change in terms of change. You cannot never think that we can predict static changes in the future. The next thing is, it's never easy. It's never easy, or it's never simple to predict what's going to go on in the future. And we're going to get into the heart of the reasons for that. And then the last thing that we found out is that everything is local. That even though there are some pretty broad models, and even though some of the models that we use are used for pretty broad landscapes, that we found that those results are usually local to that particular landscape and is not really extrapolatable to other landscapes. So with these 3 caveats said in mind, what I'd like to do then is mention to you why this is so complex and why change is constant and so on. And the reason, of course, is because In this diagram, you have not only the 5 processes that occur in these diagrams, but you can envision 500 different processes that are acting at different times and at different spaces, and they're acting at different intensities and different directions and magnitudes, so that it always, the composition and structure of a landscape is always going to be changing as these ecological processes interact with each other. And it's these interactions that not only make it difficult to predict climate change, but it's also why everything is local, and it's also why change is always constant, because these interactions are never constant. They're always changing in the future. Another aspect of climate change modeling that we really have to account for, and that needs to be accounted for in the future, is the fact that all things scale over time. All ecological processes, all ecological characteristics have an inherent scale, and as you scale these things up or down, it really matters to how the landscape is going to interact. In other words, things that happen at the second scale and on a meter or a 10-meter piece of ground, such as the burning of a fire, will scale up to a fire event over the course of days, and as it spreads to kilometers in size. And then, of course, many fire events will give you a fire regime, and this will impact not only the vegetation, but the fuels and so on. So not only do we have interactions interacting with each ecological process, but each of these interactions have an inherent scale, and that scale will also create different landscape behaviors. So the first question most managers ask is just exactly how do we predict climate change in the future? And after a couple of really intensive reviews of the literature, I think they boil down to 4 major approaches. The first approach is, let's ask the expert. Let's go out there and say, okay, bud, maybe it's some reputable scientist from some great school, and you say, okay, I want to know what's going to happen to my ponderosa pine in the future. And through deduction and inference and association, you get an answer from the expert. Now keep in mind that answer is going to be biased. It's going to have a high level of uncertainty, but in the face of a total lack of information, it may be the only thing we have to go on. The next thing we do is probably the best thing that we could possibly do, is that we need to study it. We need to do empirical and experimental studies where we go out and study these things over time and space. Here's where the FACE experiment, or the free air carbon exchange experiment, where we manipulated the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere within a forest in order to see what its response to growth, is an example of where we would study it. But the problem is that we can't study everything, and then in order to study all the interactions that take place in a particular landscape, it would require such a long time period and such a huge landscape that it almost becomes intractable. The next thing most of us end up doing is we end up analyzing it. We end up taking data from existing projects, existing studies, maybe major inventory systems or so on, like FIA, and we relate these attributes to climate using statistical modeling. And here's, many people call them SDMs, or species distribution modeling, or bioclimatic envelope approaches, or so on. And here's where we use existing data, use statistical models to extrapolate it to a new domain and see what will happen in the future. And the last thing is that we want to do is we want to simulate it. And what we want to do here is we want to take biophysical simulation modeling, where we actually simulate ecological processes and their interactions so that we can see how landscapes are going to go in the future. Now, this is probably a little more useful than bioclimatic or species distribution statistical modeling approaches, because in a statistical modeling approach, it's very difficult to include interactions with the statistical analyses. So oftentimes, if we want to simulate interactions, we really need to have a simulation approach. So what happens is the complexity of either putting in a field study, which would require us to measure things over long periods of time and over a large particular landscape, like if we wanted to look at seed dispersal and species migration, for instance, that would preclude any of the study possibilities. And then, of course, the fact that we have data from the past that we want to extrapolate in the future. Many people call this a phenomenological approach, is that what we want to do, the data from the past may not give us the behaviors in the future that we want, because those behaviors probably aren't represented in past data. So really, if we want to really look at interactions and how things interact over landscape across scales, simulation is a really important viable tool. And I don't want to say at all that simulation is a better tool. All I'm saying is that simulation, even though it has a lot of baggage, is a way that we can actually implement interactions and look at how they create new landscape behaviors. Keep in mind that we cannot do climate change without actually studying it and without actually doing the statistical analysis. So there are thousands of models available. There are stand-level models that have, the growth and yield, the gap models, ecosystem process models, but these models do not include exogenous disturbances, which means that we can't simulate mountain pine beetle epidemics as they spread across the landscape, or fire, or so on. And then we have the regional models, which are, many people call them DGVMs, for dynamic global vegetation models. And these are models that where we model landscapes at a degree latitude by a degree longitude, of very, very large domains. And while these are important to look at global changes, they really don't get at what happens on the landscape, because they don't model some major ecological processes, mainly the processes of succession and the disturbance. So in the middle, we have landscape models, and this is where I've been concentrating for the last 20 years on creating landscape models that will simulate what will be happen in the future with climate change. Landscape models, I believe, are where the rubber really meets the road. At the landscape scale is where most of the ecological processes seem to interact. And of course, there are coarser scale interactions with the atmosphere, and then there are finer scale interactions with the forest floor and so on. But I really think that the majority of interactions that occur on the landscape are at this landscape scale, which is anywhere from 10,000 to 200,000 acres. And my last caveat before we go on and present some results is that all models are bad. No one, I will never stick up for my model. The models that I built are all these visions of what I feel are important to simulate climate in the future. And they probably are not highly accurate, but where models really go on to live productive lives is when their relative results are compared in a scenario context. In other words, when we simulate a particular scenario and then compare it with a simulation of another scenario to see if in fact we lose species or gain species. That's where the real strength of climate change modeling and at a landscape scale is, and that's where most of the talk from now on will go. The model that I've developed over the course of 25 years is called FIRE-BGC, and the latest version is called FIRE-BGC v2. And it's been extensively documented in the literature. There are around 20 publications that occur in the peer-reviewed literature that look at FIRE-BGC and its application for climate change. And what I'm going to present today is some results of some studies that we've done with my colleagues. FIRE-BGC is more or less a kitchen sink model because it incorporates many, many things into a simulation architecture or platform. It mechanistically simulates many ecosystem processes, and so it will simulate tree growth, for instance, from photosynthesis, respiration, and so on. And then it takes the carbon that's allocated to tree growth into the leaves, for instance, and then it sheds the leaves, and those leaves hit the forest floor and become litter fall and so on. So it is a big, complex model that has a lot of attributes, a lot of state variables, and there are a lot of processing that goes on. And because it's such a kitchen sink model, it is oftentimes very difficult to parameterize for any given landscape, and it's very difficult to attain stability in the parameterization of that landscape. But what it does do, once we do parameterize it correctly for a landscape, is it allows us to capture climate disturbance and vegetation interactions very nicely. And we can actually simulate novel landscape behaviors with it, and that is pretty much what I'm going to be showing you today. The results today are taken from a series of experiments that we've done with my colleagues at the Missoula Fire Sciences Lab. And they span mostly throughout the Pacific Northwest for a couple of joint fire science and NSF projects that we've done across the Pacific Northwest. Most of them are in the northern Rockies of Montana and Idaho, but we also looked at Yellowstone and some landscapes in central and eastern Oregon. Now, the talk mentions tipping points, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term tipping points, you can think of a tipping point as a point of no return for a particular ecosystem, where incrementally small pushes in a particular ecosystem component, let's say landscape carbon, for instance, as that landscape carbon is pushed towards a different state because of the changing in climate or the changes in disturbance and so on, all of a sudden, at one time, it will all of a sudden go to another ecosystem state. And it'll, in other words, a lot of people like to look at it as pushing a ball up in this whole trough and valley system. And you push the ball up to the top of the thing, and then the ball will go to a different landscape behavior. As shown in the slides, where we have pinyon juniper forests that were living and healthy prior to 2000, but then after the droughts, a 5-year drought, we see that the climate has pushed the landscape to another ecosystem state where a lot of the pinyon and juniper are dead, and we have a different landscape composition. This particular project that we worked on was done with my colleague Rachel Lohman. And the first thing that she noted was that there is very little literature on tipping points. There are no statistical techniques in order to quantify a tipping point. And there's no real way to define a tipping point if you look at a time series of how an ecosystem reacts in the future. So if we look at the top graph, we see that over time, and as that particular landscape is being interacted upon by a series of climates, we can see that the line, which could be any ecosystem attribute, but let's now just think it's carbon, which is a surrogate for fuels, we see that the landscape pretty much has a stability, and it varies along a particular point. So it has a high resistance to climate change, and it also has a high resilience, in that it's not only resistant to any change, that if there is a change, that it can easily go back to its original function or its original carbon equivalent. But then if we look at the middle graph, we can see that as climate interacts with this landscape over time, sooner or later a perturbation will happen where, or the climate will get so dry that the whole ecosystem goes down and achieves a different level. And this is where we have a high resistance landscape because it was able to resist the perturbation or the climate change for a long time. But it has a low resilience in that it was unable to get back to the original point. And then lastly, we have low resilience and low resistance in that it just took a minor amount of climate change to shove this ecosystem over to a different point. The problem then is quantifying these particular things over time and space. And how do you do that with a process-based model? Well, I'm going to show you some output from FireVGC V2 that Rachel did, and this will help set the context of our tipping points experiment. Here we see the Lake McDonald watershed in Glacier National Park under historical climate, and we can see that the colors indicate the number of fires that occurred in each pixel. The blue color indicates that there were 1 to 5 fires over the course of 500 years. And you can see that in the warm, wet B2 climate, and a B2 climate is 10% more precip and 3 degrees warmer Celsius, we can see that the number of fires increased, but by not all that much. But we see under an A2 climate, which is 90% of the precip, or 10% less, and 6 degrees C warming, we see that we have an entirely different number of fires that hit the landscape. And we found that, bar none, is that wildland fire is the catalyst that will invoke or cause much of the climate change that's going to occur on most of our landscapes in the U.S. So what Rachel then did is she looked at landscape total carbon and looked at it over time under these 3 scenarios. And we also looked at if we had fire on the landscape at an historical level or if we tried to suppress it. So if we look at the two right-hand graphs, we can see that under the historical climate, the bottom right, we see that the landscape carbon more or less is stable and varies across time at a very small rate. So it's resilient and resistant to the historical changes that occurred in climate, even with the fire perturbations where we allowed fire to occur at historical levels. Then we changed the climate in the upper right, where we got a warm, wet climate, which is the B2 climate, which is a +3 degrees C. And we can see that although the productivity is a little higher, we can see that the landscape was pretty much stable and pretty much did not really achieve a tipping point after 3 degrees of warming. But if we look at the two left-handed graphs, we can see that at the A2 climate, over here, the hot, dry climate, +6 degrees warming, we see that it didn't take long before the perturbations occurred when we allowed all fires to burn, to shove that landscape into another state. And so somewhere, if we allow landscapes to burn under the climate-mediated fire regime, we see that there is a tipping point between 3 degrees Celsius and 6 degrees Celsius, where we shove this landscape over and we have significantly less, probably 20% of landscape carbon that occurs. Now, if we look and if we put fire suppression on the landscape and we try to suppress all fires, it appears that we can delay this tipping point for a while, but sooner or later a tipping point happens caused by a perturbation, mainly wildland fire, because most of the fuel is connected now in the landscape. We get a fire that's significantly large enough to shove this landscape in its new climate to a different level, and that while the full fire suppression, or where we tried to where we were effectively suppressing 90% of the fires, one fire happened, shoved it to a new level, and this resulted in a tipping point. And so, under fire suppression, we attempted to make a low resilience but highly resistant landscape. So these were some of the preliminary results that Rachel did. And what she found, that it was really odd that if we look at full suppression scenarios, we see that there are a significantly less number of fires compared to the scenarios over here where we allowed fires to burn. In fact, there were 90% less fires under full fire suppression, which we'd expect. But if we looked at the acres burned, we found that even under the A2 climate, which is the warm, wet climate +6 degrees, we had the same amount of landscape burn per year as we did if we tried to suppress all fires. And this is, of course, over a 500-year simulation, and this is because a historical fire size distribution is shifted to the right so that a lot more of the fires are larger in size. So what Rachel did then is take these preliminary results that she found and then try to construct a simulation experiment where she could actually quantify a tipping point. She looked at 3 different landscapes: the Lake McDonald watershed that we just looked at, the East Fork of the Bitterroot, which is in west central Montana, and also the Central Plateau of Yellowstone. And she simulated the climate change tipping point scenarios for each of these landscapes. In order to do this, she had 6 temperature factors where she ramped the model up, the climate in the model, from historical, 1 degree C up to 6 degrees C. And so you can see that this is the matrix, that it goes from 1 degree to 6 degrees C on the matrix. And then along here, she went to 7 precip factors, where she went from 30% of the precip of the historical record all the way up to 130% of the precip of the historical record, or plus or minus 30% precip. And what she did is then she tried to map on this matrix the value of a set of ecosystem attributes. Now keep in mind that the tipping point should vary by whatever ecosystem attribute you're looking for. Today we're only going to look at 3. We're going to look at fire rotation. And here are her tipping point graphs that she produced. Fire rotation is the amount of time it takes for fire to burn an area the size of the particular landscape. So the larger the fire rotation, the less frequent the fires. So here we find that it doesn't look like there's a significant change in fire rotation under any of the precip scenarios, and it looks like temperature is driving the fire rotation, and somewhere between 3 and 5 there's a tipping point where the fire rotation goes to about half, or becomes more frequent, twice as frequent as it was in the historical record. However, for the Yellowstone record, there doesn't seem, the tipping point seems to be somewhere around between 3 and 4 degrees Celsius. And again, precip doesn't really matter. But in the Bitterroot landscape in west central Montana, we see that there is a distinct gradient from warm, cool, wet landscapes where the fire regime is a lot less to the warm, dry. And here, tipping points are a lot more difficult to discern because they're a combination of both precipitation and temperature. But it looks like as soon as you get a 3 or 4 degree change, and the precip is less than what was normally experienced in the historical record, you get a climate change tipping point in fire rotation. So what does this mean to tree mortality? And of course, tree mortality is the interaction of fire with the vegetation, with climate, and with topography. So here we see that the darker areas are closer to 100% mortality, and the lighter areas are closer to 0% mortality. One thing I forgot to mention is that this square right here is where the precip is exactly equal to historical. So here we see that the tipping point for Glacier National Park for tree mortality occurs somewhere between 3 and 5 degrees C, and there is a slight precipitation influence. However, for Yellowstone, it appears that every fire that occurs is going to have a high tree mortality because the species that occur are going to have a high propensity for a crown fire. On the other hand, it appears that for the Bitterroot National Forest, there is also no tipping point for tree mortality. The species that occur on the landscape right now have the ability to survive fire, and even with the more frequent fire in the future, those species are able to maintain their dominance and keep on the landscape into the future. So tree mortality is not a significant, there's no significant tipping point in tree mortality. So the last thing we saw is that basal area is by far what we thought would be the most indicative of a climate, of a tipping point, because basal area is not only correlated to productivity, because basal area is correlated to leaf area, which indicates productivity, but it's also correlated to fuel loadings, canopy fuels, and so on. So any changes in basal area should indicate whether or not a tipping point occurred. So what we found is that, sure enough, that in the Glacier National Park, a tipping point probably occurred between 3 and 5 degrees, probably around 4 degrees Celsius, and as the precip got below normal. The results for Yellowstone are a bit more difficult to discern, but what we did find is that precip seems to have a more important influence of Yellowstone landscapes than temperature. And lastly, again, for that Bitterroot landscape, is that as we get to the warmer and as we get to the drier landscapes, we see less and less basal area. So the tipping point is both a combination of temperature, say around 4 to 5 degrees C, and of precipitation, less than 90% of normal. So the take-home message is that the basal area tipping points not only depend on the landscape that you're simulating, but also how much precip is there. She simulated this, or she synthesized results and found out that a tipping point, if you look at this table, a tipping point for all three landscapes occurs somewhere between 3 and 5 degrees of warming, and if precip, anything below normal, also causes the tipping point. So there is a basal area threshold, although very difficult and subtle to detect. It appears that there is a basal area threshold at which a tipping point does occur. So the take-home message for the tipping points are that they are not only unique for landscapes, but they're also unique for each of the ecological attributes that you want to use to quantify the tipping points. Now, a lot of people want to look at what happens to the species, you know, what happens to the species on the landscape. And for that Glacier National Park landscape, I'm going to show this slide, which Rachel found, where subalpine fir slowly falls out of the landscape, and we have western hemlock assuming its place on the landscape right up until 5 degrees C, where it is suddenly a smaller part of the landscape totally, and we go to more drier Douglas fir and other species. And these are the results from Rachel's tipping points experiment. But at the same time, what happened was that we were also using the model to simulate what would happen on the Lake McDonald landscape if we did restoration techniques, and especially in the context of whitebark pine restoration. And we found out that, sure enough, whitebark pine would decline over time in the Lake McDonald watershed, but only because it was getting killed by the rust, and that it could never make any significant gains in resistance. So Rachel and I included a genetic part of Fire BGC where we allowed the 5-needle pine species to allow them to become resistant to the disease over time. And we put in a genetic model that would simulate the level of resistance in the population. And we got an entirely different result than what Rachel got for her tipping points experiment. And here we see that in Glacier National Park, the king of the landscape is this blue color, which happens to be western white pine. And indeed, western white pine appears to dominate. It's the super tree of the future for Lake McDonald. Now, these graphs are very difficult, and you're just going to have to take my word that this kind of beige or brownish, orangish color is western white pine. But the big thing I wanted you to notice is that it takes around 50 to 80 years for each scenario. Here we have an A2 and a B2 climate, and here we have the base of the historical. For western white pine to overcome the blister rust, it suddenly becomes resistant to it, and then at that time it has the genetic makeup and the ability to dominate on the landscape. And not only that, it is especially dominant in the A2 landscape under full fires when we allow fires to burn. We also saw that western white pine was also dominant on the landscape if we put out fires, although at a significantly less amount. Here, when we had 98% fire suppression, we still saw under an A2 or the red line scenario major parts of the landscape being composed of western white pine, and again, it taking anywhere from 50 to 100 years for it to overcome resistance. So with one subtle change in the model, adding a genetic component, we found you got an entirely different landscape result for the Lake McDonald landscape. Another thing we also found in that restoration scenario is that it really matters where you start out in your landscape. In other words, what we found out is that we used the current amount of whitebark on the Lake McDonald landscapes to see what would happen if we restored it in the future. And when we did, we found out that it could never get above 2% of the landscape because there just wasn't enough on the landscape to provide enough propagules for it to actually become dominant. So all the other species were able to outcompete it. But as we slowly added whitebark pine to the landscape to where it comprised more of the landscape and there were more cone-bearing trees, or where it comprised more of the landscape but there were less cone-bearing trees, we found that if we had more cone-bearing trees, which is the blue line, is that we got a significantly different result. So in other words, where you start the landscape from will dictate what will happen in the future, because the processes of spatial seed distribution interacts with species migration, which in turn interacts with climate to give you an entirely different result. Now for the Yellowstone landscape, we've got different, and that is again shown in the Yellowstone landscape, where over time we saw that on the central plateau you see lodgepole pine declining on the Yellowstone landscape and Douglas fir taking this place. Now keep in mind that there could be an abundant number of other species that could also occur in this space, but those other species do not occur in or adjacent to the central plateau region. So there are no seed propagules to actually disperse into that area. So it goes to Douglas fir, only because Douglas fir is within or adjacent to the central plateau simulation area. So this is an important result, is that, and I think a realistic result is that the distance of seed dispersal and the distance from seed sources are incredibly important in what's going to happen to the landscape in the future. Now, what I'd like to do is talk about this East Fork of the Bitterroot River landscape more completely. And here we did another simulation experiment with my colleague Lisa Holsinger, where we looked at stream temperatures and its effect on bull trout habitat. Now here is what Rachel simulated for over time for the temperature changes for the East Fork of the Bitterroot landscape. And here we see that, sure enough, lodgepole pine declines in the landscape, and we get landscapes that are almost composed of Douglas fir. Lisa simulated that, and with the A2 and the B2 scenario, and in fact found the same exact things, is that under these new climates we get Douglas fir under the B2 and a Douglas fir ponderosa pine landscape under the A2 climate. And we see that with the historic fire with suppression, we see that you get a lot more subalpine fir, and if we allow fires to burn, which is allowing without any fire management at all, we see that we get this gray area, which is lodgepole pine, and it becomes less so as we go into the future. So what does this mean for the bull trout? Well, in this model, we put in a stream temperature model, which simulates stream temperatures from stream flow, from solar radiation that hits the streams, and from summer air temperatures. And here we see that the summer stream temperatures have, for historical things, for historical scenarios, are significantly lower than for future scenarios under the A2 and B2. And what's really amazing is that here is the H scenario is where we allowed all fires to burn, and the FHFS scenario is where we put out fires. And it appears that stream temperatures do not seem to be different from whether or not we allow fires to burn or whether we attempt to put out all fires. And this is because, and this of course results in the fact that the bull trout stream area or the affected bull trout habitat is significantly going to be different if we have an A2 climate in the future. What this means is that the dark blue areas of bull trout habitat currently are under the B2, and you can see that there are really no real changes between fires and fire suppression, and that we see a lot more red areas or non-bull trout habitat for bull trout in the future. The interesting interactions here are that in the fire sizes, the average fire sizes for the landscape are nearly the same across all scenarios, whether it be fire suppression or fire management, which is allowing all fires to burn, and whether the climate scenarios. But the variability of those fire sizes are much greater under a warmer and drier climate. But believe it or not, if we look at tree mortality, we see that if we allow all fires to burn or replicate the fires using fuel treatments, we can significantly reduce tree mortality on the landscape versus whether or not we try to put out all fires. So we have significantly less tree mortality if we allow fires to burn, which is counterintuitive to most of people's of the ASCIT or experts that have been asked. You can see that if we allow all fires to burn, we get the percent of landscapes burned each year is around 6% per year, which is significantly different. And the number of large fires are much larger, but the amount of tree mortality is lower, even lower than that occurred in the historical. And the end result is that that fire really is not a big driver of stream dynamics. It's more or less the change in air temperature that's driving stream dynamics. And the last thing I want to include is the stuff that we've done on grazing in southeastern Oregon. And here I did this with a colleague, Bob Riggs. And Bob Riggs went and simulated 5 grazing regimes where we didn't use wildlife only, then cattle only, and then we put cattle ×1 and cattle ×2 with the other species. And then we had no fires, and of course we tried to suppress fires. And our results here, I'll try to go through this pretty quickly, is what we found is that the dotted lines are where we have no fires at all, and the solid lines are where we where we've suppressed fires. And I'm sorry, the dotted lines are where we've allowed fires to burn. And you can see that under the historical climates down low is that if we allow fires to burn, that we have significantly less over time biomass on the landscape. And this makes sense, of course. And that, and this more or less seems to hold up even in the future climates. But what we also found is that when we introduced grazing, we found that in the historical scenarios, we found that if we put out all fires or allowed fires to burn, it was significantly different, and there was no significantly different between any of the grazing scenarios. But as we allowed fires to burn and suppress fires, we found that there was the harder you graze the ground, the more it influenced fire spread, and the more it decreased the fire return interval. And that heavy grazing in future climates that are hot and dry will limit the actual spread of the fire across the landscape and cause the fire return intervals to be smaller, which will then affect all of the other tree processes that occur. So in summary, I'll just go back to my 3 caveats and say that, again, climate change is constant, and climate change is surely going to be changing in the future, and that we should never think of our landscapes, both in the past and in the future, as anything static. We should think of everything as changing, and that tipping points will not only vary by ecosystem element, they'll vary by the time of evaluation. In other words, we may not have a tipping point if we evaluate over 100 years, but we may have a tipping point if we evaluate over 1,000 years. And that these tipping points are very subtle, and they're very difficult to distinguish when we look at them with simulated time series. Next, it's never easy. It's very difficult to take the output from these simulation models and try to determine exactly what factors are causing the simulation results to happen. And in fact, it appears that every time we change the model, either subtly, like we did for the genetics one, or entirely, like we did for the grazing one, we get an entirely different answer. And lastly, as we saw with the 3 landscapes that Rachel simulated, is that everything is local, that the findings for one landscape cannot be extrapolated to another landscape, and that we really have to do the down and dirty work to quantify what will happen to our landscapes in the future, and we need to simulate each one individually. And lastly is that it is very important that you realize that it's the interactions and feedbacks between vegetation, fuels, fire, topography, and climate that will dictate landscape dynamics in the future. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening. I know it was a pretty dense subject, and it was very difficult to interpret some of those graphs, but I hope that I helped shed some light and hopefully you were able to see how complex interpreting climate change in the future it really is.
All right, thanks, Bob. Yeah, that was a whole lot to take in there, but that was very interesting. One thing I was thinking about while you were presenting these is would there be a way with these models to sort of mimic different forest management strategies that, say you're looking at how these landscapes are going to change in the future, but if you're wanting them to go a different route or you're wanting to help them along that route, is there a way to stick in, to model different silvicultural or different types of steps forest managers could take to push forests into certain directions? Is that something you could do with this?
Yeah, Fire VGC has a management component. Right now we allow 6 different management actions: clear cuts, partial cuts, prescribed burnings, and so on. And you get to implement these at different levels of intensity and so on. And in fact, the results that I presented for Lisa Holsinger's talk, the FM scenario, the fire management scenario, included both fuel treatments and allowing fires to burn.
Okay.
So yes, these models can be modified to do that, and we've done it, I think, pretty successfully with Fire VGC V2.
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. Questions come in. This is from Andy Thode, and Andy asks, what does the full fire suppression model assume? yes, putting out all fires, but as small fires, etc.?
The way that suppression is modeled is that we limit the number of ignitions based on the level of suppression, and then we change the fire size distribution based on climate and the level of suppression. So believe it or not, is that the change in fire size distribution is not that great, and it's often the same as the historical. So what we're actually seeing when we simulate these things is the interaction between the landscape becoming more connected with fuel, a lot less burn areas that would stop a fire, and the fact that fires are then allowed to actually increase or get larger as they burn up more and more and more fuel.
Okay. Well, that is all the questions. There's no one else has written in, so I'll just remind everybody, if this webinar has been recorded, I'll have the link to this posted up in about, usually it takes me about 20-30 minutes to get it up there, and it'll be on Advances in Fire Practice, and you can pass that along to anyone that you think might have missed it and would like to see it. And with that, Bob, I appreciate it. Thank you for your time. It's very interesting stuff.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for listening.
Okay, thanks.